Well, Christopher, we've now come to our fourth time together during Lent to talk about these theories concerning what took place in the atonement of Jesus. And as we talked about earlier, atonement meant or means a coming together or being made whole or being made well. We can think of a lot of examples of what that means. And the purpose, of course, is what we're talking about. The purpose of the atonement and the why of the atonement, we have to try to make sense of that. And so we talked about sin, and we talked about various forms of understanding what took place in the atonement. We talked about substitution. We talked about ransom. We talked about more examples. Well, today we're going to talk about reconciliation theory. And reconciliation is a great word. Why don't you talk a little bit about what you think about what this theory means, and then we can just chat about that a little later.
Sure. So, this theory is another one that's really steeped in a lot of the language we use in church and language I use as well. And it really, to kind of first understanding, I have to go back to the very beginning, to Genesis, when humanity was in the garden and there was this relationship between humanity and God. In fact, when I did the story the first time, I talked about how God was reconciling us to bring us back to that image of the garden where God walks in the cool of the day with humanity. That's a direct relationship, a very connected relationship. In fact, God speaks about how God has created humanity to be in community with. There's a very strong imagery of God creating humanity to be in community with. There's a connection, there's a relationship. And then, there's different ways to look at what some people call the fall. Is the idea of the apple and the garden, things like that. But some people talk about it as humanity turned away from God. Some people talk about humanity as sort of breaking the law or the rule of God. But in this particular one, it's more of the humanity breaks that relationship. We all have relationships in our lives, and probably everybody's had one relationship where something's happened. One person did something, or maybe another person did something, and in some way it's broken or severed that relationship. And that's where that image comes from. So the idea of with God, there was a relationship, something happened, or in this case, humanity did something and it broke the relationship. And I don't know about you, but I've had friends before where, something's happened and you don't talk to them anymore. And then, it severed that relationship. And so something is needed to fix it. Something is needed to bring it back to that place. Like I talked about, like I said in the story, is there's this long period of time where God is working through humanity to fix that relationship, to bring it back to where it is, to bring it back to walking in the cool of the day with humanity. And so reconciliation theory basically says that has happened with God, and now something had to happen. And so God worked through the Israelites to eventually bring this person Jesus. And Jesus is, as we think of as part of the Trinity, God in flesh, comes into the world, and he dies on the cross to open the way or to try to fix that relationship, to reconcile us. In fact, if you remember, atonement means something close to unity. So I think that actually really works really well with this theory, because unity means bringing back together. And so through Jesus' sacrifice, he's taking that first step to fix that relationship. As we think about relationships that have been damaged in the past, somebody has to take that first step, and then the other person has to take that step, and eventually you can come back together. And so Jesus, his sacrifice, is taking that first step to fix the relationship between humanity and God. And then it requires us to take that same step. It's very relational in this particular image of atonement, of sacrifice. And I kind of like, if you watch the study, which we did, he talks about how there's the vertical between us and God, and then the horizontal between us and humanity. So again, very relational. So we are reconciled with God so we can be reconciled with one another. It's sort of, as Jesus said, you have to love the Father so you can love the children. And so if you get nothing else out of this, it's about relationship, and it's about fixing a broken relationship between us and God taking that step, that first thing that has to happen, so that we can find reconciliation with God relationally, and in that way fix what was broken. And that's kind of how I guess, in a nutshell, how I would say it.
The interesting thing about that is it requires us to understand God as being a personal God, not meaning my personal God, but having an interest in a personality and a reality that has an interest in us, that wants a relationship with us. Now, of course, there are many understandings of God out there that believe in a God, but think that it's a God that's untouchable, uninterested, exists in an unapproachable light, and has no interest in us at all. So it presupposes, and I agree with this, that God cares, wants the relationship, created us to be in relationship with God. So that, I think that's wonderful. I think that's exactly what the scriptures teach us. But again, that's not universally held, I think. So what you're saying to me is that what might be summed up in what theology calls the mediation, that Jesus is the mediator. And mediators are very important people. So you can think of now, with you're talking about your relationships, and you use the example of a friend maybe that you had a falling out with, and neither side seems willing or interested, at least for a time, to restore that relationship. And it requires someone to take the initiative. Okay, someone has to take that first step towards the other. And think now in terms of mediation, that there are two people, your friends are separated from each other, but another friend who cares about you both and loves you both steps in between you and says, let me be the one that helps you come back together. So it's like what you're talking about. It's all about relationship. Absolutely true. The mediation theory would suggest that Jesus came into the world to be that bridge, to open that way so that literally one could reach out to the other. Now, where you sometimes run into trouble with some of our friends in the Protestant tradition, that they would say, suggesting that humanity has to react at all, that either they have to take that, there's a step they have to take, translates to them as works righteousness, meaning you have a role in your justification. That's not what this means. Unfortunately, people sometimes make that mistake. I think you're 100% correct. It represents relationships. And we can think about human relationships. And Jesus came into the world to allow us to make that connection. And Jesus is present, the entirety of the divine agency of God and the human agency. And within himself, he brings these two together and makes a way open. Now, my sermon on Sunday, as I told you before we got on, was about the prodigal son. And the way I was looking at this, and I didn't think about it till we were really talking about this relationship aspect. But my whole point in my sermon is that the reason the son had a way back home, the reason a way had been opened, is because there had been a mediation that took place. God had entered into it, and had the son realized his estrangement from his father, his home, and the father, although saying to his older son later that his son was as if he was dead to him, because he thought that relationship may never be restored, but he always kept open the way. The way was made open for humanity. If we see humanity as being represented in the prodigal, the humanity recognizes there's a way home. Why? Is because Christ made that way open. He is the mediator to the way home. So that's how I see this a little bit. But let's just talk a little bit more about this concept of this example, because again, I'm not a big believer that Jesus is regulated or is only an example for us. That he actually is. There's something tremendously important in understanding who Jesus is in this whole process. But let's go with this example theory in this context. And how can Jesus be this concept of reconciliation as Christian people, as followers after the example of Jesus? How might we put into practice in our life right now the example of reconciliation as Jesus has taught it to us?
Well, sure. I think that one of the things that it teaches me is that sometimes the relationship is important enough that you don't have to be right. You can be the one who steps forward and tries to fix it. Because, in the example, of course, that humanity was the one that breaks a relationship. Humanity is the one that does the thing that breaks it. Yet God is trying to fix it. And God even pays the price to fix it because God cares and loves for humanity enough that it doesn't matter about trying to force something. It's about trying to bring them back into relationship. So, I imagine we all probably have something that maybe somebody did something to us and we're not really happy about it, or said something we didn't like, and I hate to say it, this last couple of years politically, there's been a lot of stuff that a little thing can cause people to really break relationship. And I think it teaches us sometimes that we can be the people who can be the way to fix that relationship. We can take that first step. We can try to heal broken relationships, because a lot of times, it hurts us as much as anything else. And really, sometimes we hold on to anger anger at people much longer than we need to, and it really is hurting us. And we can fix that, let it go. We can do something that helps to fix relationships, because honestly, I think the world needs more peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers. And sometimes you don't have to be right. Sometimes you can be a peacemaker even when maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. Maybe let that go and just be a peacemaker, because I think that's the example that Jesus puts forth for us. He doesn't come down to wag his finger at us and tell us how terrible we are. He doesn't come down to try to prove a point that humanity broke the relationship. He comes down in the world to fix, to heal, to reconcile. And I think we should be the people that reconcile relationships with each other and with the world, because that's what Jesus calls us to do.
So we should be people of the atonement.
Yeah,
exactly. Let's bring this now as individuals you were talking about, and I think that's 100% correct. Let's talk about this as a church. So we are churches. That means gathering at congregations. We're Christians gathered together in congregations. This is what we are called to do. This is the biblical example. This is what Jesus called us to be, is together in relationships with each other. So ought not then, from what you just said, the first place we should be working towards reconciliation is in our families, our homes, of course, if that is needed. But ought it not start in our congregations too?
Yeah, I think so. I think we can, if anything, the example theory, I think, makes a little bit of sense here, because the church should be a place that's different than society, different from the places you see outside. Because when you go out into the world, a lot of times, like I was saying with personal relationships, it's the same way. We should be the place where people can go and know they can be safe, that they can be reconciled with God and with each other. I think it should be a place where it feels different, because it's a place that is filled with the love of God, which is a place that doesn't judge, that doesn't push people away. It doesn't have to agree. I think that's something we always get a little mixed up. You don't have to agree with somebody. We'll use the political example. You don't have to agree politically with somebody, but you can still love them. You can still be in a relationship. You can still reconcile yourself with them. Sometimes we try to push those things together. I know that God sent Jesus on the cross because he said, I just agree with your sin. It's great. I love it. No, he was saying, I love you enough, despite your sin, to stay in relationship. And the church needs, I think, to be the same way. A place where people can go, where people love and care for one another. They have differences, because, of course, we have differences, but they still care and they hold relationship. And the differences are reconciled, not meaning that they're necessarily got rid of, but they're reconciled by love to come together. And I think too often our churches aren't like that. I think too often there's differences that pull us apart, as opposed to realizing what we have that holds us together and reconciles us together. Because Jesus is the thing. Jesus is the one. He's the main point. He's the place of gravity that pulls everything together. When we come to that place, the place of the love of Jesus Christ, all the other things can be let go of and reconcile ourselves to each other. So I think that's what the church needs to do.
And, I've been a pastor for going on 33 years, for my first time in the pulpit. But I'll tell you, and I have told you in the past, and I tell others, that I've had examples of churches in which one party in a breached relationship would not even sit on the same side of the room as a party from that other side of that, and would literally create division within the church by their own personal division. And the hope is to try to, so the church, if the church itself as the body that worship together in a given place, perhaps, if they cannot be reconciled one to the other, how do we expect people outside the church to want to be a part of what is a divisive society within the church? And of course, the politics of our church just like I do. And that's at issue today. And I know a lot of people are very discouraged by that. But we, as you've just shown, as we can be examples of reconciliation, it really does start at home, I think. And by home, I mean in our own homes, but also in our home church. And as that, then, an active reconciler or a peacemaker, if you like, what kind of tangible steps might we take in reaching out in reconciliation within our own congregations? Now, I know we're not going to talk about people's problems and that, but what sorts of things could the church do? And I know I'm catching you off guard on this, I know that, but what sorts of things might we do within the church as pastors, as an example, or leaders of the church? What kind of things might we do to offer opportunities for reconciliation? Any thoughts come to mind?
Well, I think it's tough, but I think modeling reconciliation, I think, is important for us as pastors. I know that we have people who have different opinions in our church, and I never try to push people away because they disagree with me or because I don't think they're the same. I think having these places where we can have conversation, open and honest conversation, with the ability to say, I agree to disagree. But I think it really, in the end, comes down to really people understanding that we're reconciled through one thing that is unchanging, that is across the board, that doesn't have anything to do with political, doesn't have anything to do with specific personal opinions. It's Jesus Christ. If we can come to that place first and say, this is what holds us together, so everything else can be there, that I think is really important. And I think we have to talk about it that way, and we have to put Jesus first. We have to put God first in our lives and put God first in our churches. If we put other things first, any number of things, if there are people listening and you can think of many different things first, that's something that's going to fracture, it's going to pull us apart, because it's something that is of this world. Jesus told us we should be in this world, but not of this world. And I think in that way, he means that we are to be focused solely on Jesus Christ and the mission of Jesus Christ, and everything else can be there, but it doesn't have to be at the center. When you take that and put it at the center, it pulls apart. So I think as a church, having open and honest conversation about things and doing it in a way that is understanding that we're doing it, as our good friend Dr. Elmer Clare talked about, coram Deo, meaning with God, and understanding that everything we do in the church is coram Deo. God is with us. And if we're standing in the image of God or in the light of God, we have to act as such. We have to live as such. We have to understand that God is with us as we do these things. And we want to stand before the Lord God and attack another one of his children. And that's sort of that part of the understanding we're all loved children of God. And so when you look at your neighbor, look at the people in the church, they are loved children of God. How should you treat them? You should treat them as neighbor, as brother, as sister, as, the person that God loved so much that died on the cross for. So I think it starts with our culture and then can flow through, and then eventually, hopefully, people can see that and live into it. But it's difficult. It's really difficult to have a tangible plan to try to show people that the division, the vitriol is not a good way to go when people are so steeped in it, because our culture is so steeped in it. It's really hard. It's really hard to find a way to pull people back. But people need to first know the church is a different place. It's not a place where we come to attack. It's a place we come to stand before Jesus and live together. And that's the best I can think of right now.
Yeah, Dr. Collier I hate to speak for him, but I think what he might say in regards to what you were saying is that we participate in the life of God, and God participates in our lives as well. There's a relationship that is embodied in the human experience of participating in the life of Christ, because Christ has embodied both the divine and the human into himself. He has opened the way for that relationship to extend, to bring humanity into that relationship and to participate in the life of God, which sounds a little strange, but he's a pretty deep guy. So perhaps then what the church could do is create opportunities for people to engage in dialogue that allows for a kind of redeeming of relationships, we could say, or an atonement of relationships. But see, one of the crucial places we have to be doing that all the time is also helping people find the way to redeem their relationship with God, which is what we're all sinners, as the scriptures clearly teach. We all miss the mark. So I see it as a two-way street there. I see it as we offer the opportunities for people to be reconciled unto God and God unto them via the media of the mediator through Jesus. And I also see it as a place of example where we can be reconciled to each other, hence your vertical and horizontal example. And so, yeah, opening ways of conversation or community. And community, once again, comes back into the story, doesn't it? Once again, we turn back to a sense of community. Communities exist and hold together through relationships. You can have laws all you like. You can make all the offer any number of laws, but in the end, that will only enforce a certain aspect of community. It will not make community. The only thing that makes community are relationships. And those relationships are easily, in our experience, are easily damaged. People are very sensitive and are hurt easily by other people's perceived, that what they perceive in other people as being judgments regarding them. God has judged us, okay? We have been judged, and God has that right to do it. But what is Jesus' advice to us? Judge only as you want to be judged yourself, meaning God's judgment. Judge not, lest ye be judged in the way you're judging. He calls us into to looking for pathways to reconciliation with each other, which is what I think you're talking about here. So if we're able to see ourselves in light of our own humanity, does it not become easier to understand someone who might have offended us and to recognize their humanity? Do we not give ourselves a break? Sometimes we don't, but a lot of people are going to be pretty willing to give themselves a break. Does not meaning loving, being willing to extend that same sense of willingness to give the other a break and maybe to be the one that takes that step? Is that not what Jesus is demonstrating to us too?
Yeah. I think that we see in Jesus Christ the willingness to forgive, the willingness to take that step, the willingness to even do something and pay himself for that forgiveness. Yeah, definitely.
So I think maybe that is partial, although I surely have no greater insight than anybody else, but I think that may be in part the humanity aspect of Jesus. So critical to our salvation and atonement is the humanity as well as the divinity of Jesus, which I know is a very difficult concept for us all. And I hope people out there understand. It doesn't matter if you know how trained of a theologian you are, how long you've been in school, or how many degrees you have. That's still a very puzzling aspect of our understanding. It's one of those things that we simply have to continue to explore, knowing we will never define, because God defines God's self. And so we can only know what God has us and allows us to know. And as Christian people, what we have come to believe that to be true in is in the life and story of Jesus Christ. But anyway, so any last words about reconciliation? You and I get along pretty well. I don't think we got too many things to reconcile. Maybe we do. Most sons have something with their father, but I mean, any last thoughts about reconciliation that you would leave people with as we move forward in Lent that might be useful as we move towards contemplation of Jesus on the cross?
Sure, there's definitely Christmas presents or birthday presents I wanted that I never got. So I've given that up. It's okay. I'll let it go. But I guess I think reconciliation in our churches, I think the image of we have to be reconciled with God so then we can reconcile with the people. I think that's something that's really important. And I think it's also important for us to understand that in our churches, it's the whole community that has to be reconciled. It's not an image of, too often we kind of think of as the professional, priestly people are the ones that get, they are the ones with God. Everybody else is kind of, it's the whole church is coming together and seeking reconciliation with God so they can reconcile with each other. And one thing that I think is always the most amazing image is, as we can change our church and our group, as we go out in the world, we can take that with and change the world. That's why I still love the Methodist Church's mission statement, making disciples, meaning people that reconcile with God and with each other so they can go out and change the world, meaning reconcile with God and each other. It's important for us to understand that we all come together as the body of Christ, all seeking reconciliation. It's a community thing that's why reconciliation, I do really like this image, because there's so much when it comes to relationships, and there's so many relationships between us and God, and how we can mirror that relationship that God has in God's own self, in the Trinity, in our own churches, a self-giving, respectful relationship that can be done in our community. And I think it's important for us to remember that it's not something somebody's going to do for us, something we all do, and then we do together. And I just think it's too often we kind of forget that part, that it's not on, the church or your pastor or that person to reconcile you with God. It's for you to reconcile with God and then work in reconciling with each other. It's only when we all come together in community and live that way that we can live into this understanding of reconciliation.
And that brings to mind, and this last thing I'll say, it brings to mind to me something that's actually sad in my view. It's where we ought to come together, where we truly experience community with each other, with God, is at the communion table. And, that's where we literally are brought together and connected, not only with each other in the room, but not only with God, but with each other throughout time. We're taken back to Jesus' own presentation at the table when he stood there and he did these wonderful things and said, do this and remember them. Don't forget them. Don't forget me. This is what we're called to be, united around the table. And yet, as we all know, unity around the communion table is not a reality in the Christian church, to our own, I think, shame. Jesus said one day we will be unified around that table together. Every knee will bow and confess Jesus is Lord. This is prophecy, but I believe it with all my heart. One day, all of our divisions that are imposed mostly from the outside on the church, by the way, most of these divisions are imposed on us. And unfortunately, rather than hold back or to stand against them, we invite them right in the front door, which is sad too. But I like what you're saying. And I hope that people take this into Lent and they think about this and meditate on this as we grow ever nearer to that Sunday, or that Friday rather, where we observe the death of our Lord on the cross. So, okay, well, till next time, I'll look forward to our next conversation. Until next time, may everybody out there be blessed.